مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. منذ 11 سبتمبر تركز جزء كبير من جهودنا لمكافحة الإرهاب على منع الإرهابيين من الدخول إلى بلادنا. نقاط مراقبة الحدود، ونقاط مراقبة المطارات، ونقاط مراقبة جوازات السفر. كل من يسافر إلى أمريكا يعرف القصة. ولكن ماذا عن الإرهابيين الموجودين بالفعل داخل الولايات المتحدة، المتطرفون الذين نشأوا في أمريكا وانقلبوا على بلادهم؟ ما مدى خطورة هذه المشكلة؟ وما مدى فعالية حملة الحكومة في القضاء عليها؟ للإجابة على هذه الأسئلة ضيفانا هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن هما الخبيران بقضايا الإرهاب وان زراتي وشيمس هيوز. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. Since September 11th, our nation has focused its energies on preventing a recurrence of catastrophic terrorism from enemies from abroad. But what about enemies here at home? What about terrorism inside our country? Is this a serious problem? What are we doing about it? And today I'm delighted to welcome two of our nation's leading experts on terrorism to talk about the threat of domestic terrorism. Juan Zarate, Seamus Hughes, thank you very much for joining us on Dakhil, Washington.
Thank you, Rob.
Is there such a thing as domestic terrorism? Juan?
Absolutely. I started my career in the terrorism world, Rob, before September 11th as a terrorism prosecutor. And I was spending equal amount of time looking at international terrorism from Al-Qaeda as it was developing, from Hamas, from groups like the FARC in Colombia, as I was on domestic terrorist groups in the United States, militant groups, militia groups that had evolved over time. And we had witnessed in the United States the Timothy McVeigh attack on a federal building in Oklahoma. And so within the US government, both by definition of law as well as by experience and attention, we clearly knew that there were domestic terrorist threats and groups that were willing to use even weapons of mass destruction to attack the federal government, to attack fellow citizens for an ideological cause or militant cause to affect US policy and government behavior. That's the definition of terrorism, and we've known and seen that over time. Post 9/11, of course, we focused heavily on Al-Qaeda, most recently Daesh, other forms of international terrorism that have come from violent Islamic extremist brands. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that there are different ideologies, there are different forms that terrorism can take. And certainly we've had not only a history of domestic terrorism in the US, but also we now need to focus on what may be greater and greater extremism driven by political polarization and problems we have in our society.
So I know you mentioned it in passing, but I want to clarify it for our viewers. What makes domestic terrorism what it is, as opposed to just being, a very heinous crime that somebody commits inside our country?
Yeah, it's a furtherance of an ideological belief, trying to use violence in order to get a political end. And in fact, Juan's absolutely right. We've seen a resurgence of domestic terrorists in the last few years. To put it in context, in the U.S. we have 1,000 active investigations for the Islamic State supporters. We also have 1,000 active investigations for domestic terrorists, and that could be white supremacists or anti-government folks. We're seeing their use of the internet. We're seeing them recruit. I think Charlottesville is a great example of one of the largest white supremacist rallies we've seen in our history. 500 people coming out advocating for an ideological bent.
So when you look at these, say, 1,000 investigations, who are the targets? Left, right, religious groups, ideological groups? What are the motivations? What do we see, Seamus?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. A good number of them are white supremacists, advocating for essentially a white ethno-state, but not an insignificant number are anti-government extremists, individuals who think that the government is pushing too much on their personal liberties. We also do see a rising of left-wing extremists, anti-fascist movements, which aren't necessarily as violent as the white supremacists, but have been rising and getting more and more concerning, especially as they're feeding off each other. So in academia, we call it reciprocal radicalization. So you have the far right and the far left showing up at rallies and essentially getting into fights about which way they think is right.
One thing to keep in mind is, these groups and these movements evolve over time, and so in many ways the underlying ideology, even the organizations, simply have changed over time, maybe changed brands, changed names, certainly changed tactics. The use of social media, I think, has been part of the dynamic recently to increase the attractiveness of some of these groups. But unlike, I think, some of the commentary of late, which is to say the U.S. government has never focused on these groups, or there has been no law enforcement attention to these groups. Historically, there's been quite a bit of attention to these groups. In fact, one of the jokes in U.S. law enforcement, certainly when I was a prosecutor, was you had perhaps more government informants and agents in these groups than the actual groups themselves. So there was a lot of enforcement attention because there was a sense of risk, not only because of the violence that they perpetrated, but the risk that they represented socially. A lot of these groups early, especially in the 1990s, were anti-tax movements. You remember the Montana Freeman case. There was these people who were protesting, in essence, being taxed by the U.S. government and being militant about it and having compounds and confrontations with U.S. law enforcement. And so over time, you've seen these groups evolve, and as Seamus notes, you now have this polarization on the right and the left where not only are they more vocal, are they more present online, but they're willing to be more violent, not only with each other, but against the government and against innocent civilians.
If I may, I think Juan's absolutely right in the evolution too, and especially when it comes to white supremacist movements. You're not necessarily, you're still seeing those KKK rallies with
the Ku Klux Klan.
Ku Klux Klan rallies, but in many ways they're trying to mainstream their argument. So they're wearing the suits and ties and using coded words when they talk about a white ethno-state. And so they're trying to get away from this kind of idea of a very violent group to trying to get more and more into a conversation into the mainstream.
All right, lots of questions. First, so when we put it all together, 1,000 investigations, left, right, hard right, how many people are we talking about?
So 1,000 active investigations, those are just the individuals who rise to a level of an FBI assessment, right? You can multiply that by 3 or 4 times and get your general sense of what the scope is on those individuals. And
would you say, should our viewers think that there are therefore 3,000 to 4,000 domestic American terrorists out there?
No, I mean, you can't go that far. I think it's very hard to put a number on this type of stuff, especially because individuals don't necessarily sign a pledge card to join a domestic terrorist group. It's just not what they understand, that if they do those type of overt acts, they'll end up on FBI's law enforcement radar. So you can get a sense of the movement both in the in-person rallies, but also a sense of the movement in terms of how they use the online environment. So there's a social media website called Gab, which white supremacists and anti-government folks use pretty regularly. And it had tens of thousands of members. Now, you never know if they're in the US or Canada or Europe. In many ways, they're in all of those places.
This is an important point that Seamus makes, because I think the investigations are often targeted on an individual, but it may be that the FBI and U.S. law enforcement is interested in a conspiracy or a network. These individuals tend to congregate in militia groups or in social networks, et cetera. So these investigations often involve more than one individual. But it's important, I think, for the viewers to understand the complications of the label of terrorism from a legal perspective. You asked us before, and Seamus gave a great answer in terms of the need for an intent element to be a part of defining an act of terrorism. The reason that's important and interesting is viewers have to keep in mind we have the First Amendment in the United States. That's the freedom of speech, freedom of ideas. Even virulent and dangerous ideas are protected. That is to say, someone can say, I want to be separate from other races. I want to be a separate political entity within the United States. In fact, I reject the federal government. That's all acceptable. That's protected. That's not illegal.
So, but what's the difference between a hate crime and a terrorist crime? So the guy who shot up the synagogue in Pittsburgh or the guy who shot up the church in Charleston, hate crimes, are these acts of terrorism?
Not necessarily. A hate crime can be an act of terrorism, and a terrorist act can be a hate crime, but the distinction is the intent of the actor. What does the perpetrator of that act of violence intend with that action? Is it to change political behavior and policies of the U.S. government? If that's the case, and to terrorize the population as a result, that is an act of terror. If it's simply to attack somebody because you don't like their ethnicity or background, having nothing to do with government policy, that's a hate crime. Or you don't like their sexual orientation, that's a hate crime. That's why when you have these acts of mass violence in the U.S., there's such a debate around, is this an act of terror? And you see government officials having to say, we don't know yet. And you could say, well, if 100 people are being shot, how is that not an act of terror? In the U.S. context, for legal purposes and even political purposes, you have to wait to understand what is the intent of the actor. And I think that's often hard for not just Americans to understand, but international observers to understand. Why are you calling this an act of terror and something else not? And that question of what is their intent, why are they doing this, is the critical dimension.
And in many ways, our laws haven't caught up with the realities. You have a foreign terrorist designated list, and then you can charge someone with terrorism or support of that foreign terrorist list. There's not an equivalent in the U.S. context of a domestic terrorism list. So if you join the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, or other far-right groups, it's not like that automatically gets you an arrest for that, as opposed to if you join the Islamic State, or the so-called Islamic State, that is enough for an arrest.
All right, let's back up for a second. I think we could all agree that people aren't born terrorists, they become them. Do we know anything about is there a uniquely American way in which the people we're talking about became radicalized?
Yeah, each person is different. The internet does play a key role, especially recently, for radicalization of domestic terrorists. But in many ways, historically, we've seen domestic terrorists come from families and friends, right? So you're more likely to become a domestic terrorist if your friends and family also share the views that you would on white supremacists and anti-government movements, right? And just because we have that First Amendment right, that protected speech, those things are allowed to percolate out. And so it's a different dynamic for this.
I think one of the things you've seen in the academic work, and Seamus is one of the best in the business in terms of looking at countering violent extremism in all its forms. We've tried to look for categories and factors, and I think Seamus is right. Every individual is different. But there are two elements that I think are fairly consistent, whether you're talking about violent Islamic extremism or far-right extremism, far-left extremism, communist extremism. One is individuals sort of falling prey to an ideology or shifting their ideology mindset because of a sense of alienation or a sense of disruption. Emile Durkheim, the academic, talked about ennui, sort of a moment of shift in their life. And so there's been a lot of academic research looking at terrorists sort of becoming terrorists at a moment of shift in their life. The second is a search for identity. These groups of whatever stripe give people a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, to which then they can attach their rhetoric, their violent activity, their associations. And so those are interesting factors that experts like Seamus and others consistently look at, regardless of the group or the label.
You refer to groups quite a lot. Is there really a phenomenon that we can identify of lone wolf terrorists, or is that just a term that the media and pop culture has associated with this?
I happen to think it's a difficult one to defend, because I do think it depends on what you're talking about in terms of the ties of the individual actor willing to commit an act of terror and the group and a broader ideology. So for example, in the United States, many of the individuals that have been labeled lone wolf by the media have had some connection or tie historically or online or via ideological ties to known movements or groups that have inspired them to act. And so Are they truly lone wolves at that point? Probably not. Are they part of a broad group of 24 members who are trying to attack the United States? Probably not. So I think that definition is difficult because in many cases these individuals fit into a broader movement or ideology. They see themselves as part of that and may act alone, but that doesn't necessarily make them a lone wolf as if they came out of nowhere. But they are part of a phenomenon or a movement.
And they don't operate in a vacuum. They may be lone actors when they commit the attack, but think of Dylan Roof, who killed 14 individuals at the African American church, right?
In Charleston, South Carolina.
If you talk to his roommates, they all knew he held these beliefs. There's something we call in academia the bystander effect. And you look at terrorism cases, more than half of the time, if you interview the family and friends, they say, yeah, there was something off with him, and I knew what was going on, but I didn't really know what to do, or if I called someone, I was worried I was going to get them in trouble. And so these folks don't just sit in their basement and not spill what they're thinking.
All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about what the U.S. government is and isn't doing to address the phenomenon of domestic terrorism in just a moment. Again, our panelists include Juan Zarate. Juan is one of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts. He is the chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network, senior national security analyst for NBC News, and visiting lecturer of law at the Harvard Law School. He's highly sought after because of his exemplary public service as assistant to President George W. Bush and deputy national security advisor for combating terrorism. Previously, Juan was the first ever assistant secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. Sitting to his left is Seamus Hughes. Seamus is one of America's leading experts on homegrown violent extremism. He currently serves as deputy director of the program on extremism at George Washington University here in Washington. Previously, he served as the senior counterterrorism advisor for the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. Prolific writer and regular media commentator, Seamus has appeared in all the elite media outlets, from the New York Times to 60 Minutes, and has testified before the U.S. Congress on multiple occasions. All right, gentlemen, we've spoken so far about domestic terrorism of white extremists and of the right and the left. We haven't mentioned really the words Islamic extremism or Islamic terrorism here in the United States. To what extent is that a problem? Or to what extent isn't it a problem in terms of domestic American terrorism? Juan?
I think it remains a persistent problem, but it's not one that I think occupies the mind of the public as much as it did, obviously, post 9/11. Certainly, if you listen to the FBI director, both past and current, the reality is there are multiple cases. The number given often is 1,000 in every state of the union regarding domestic actors, be they American citizens or U.S. persons in the country, who are under investigation for ties to violent Islamic extremist groups. And so there's a reality to people who are actually part of these groups. There are numerous cases brought that are often not well publicized unless Seamus makes them public, where people are sending aid, material assistance to terrorist groups, and those are happening on a fairly regular basis. And so there's a sort of common and current set of cases that the U.S. government is worried about. What you don't have is worry about a mass group of al-Qaeda members or mass group of Daesh members attacking in the United States. I think the concern is largely individual small groups that may emerge with the concern that they may be developing encryption and other technologies that maybe are advancing more quickly than law enforcement. But otherwise, there's a steady state of investigations and a common concern about this problem.
And I would add to that, the story of ISIS-inspired terrorism in the U.S. is a story of homegrown terrorism.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for helping to elucidate this very important topic for our viewers abroad, that it's not just focused, our nation is not only focused on terrorism coming from, say, Daesh, but that we have serious issues here that we are focusing on, and that our nation is facing. Thank you very much, Seamus Hughes, Juan Zarate.
I would actually have people just fricking vote. Because if everyone in the country voted, especially young people and especially in midterms, we would have a completely different government that would be more aligned with what people really want.
When you're a country founded on an idea rather than a distinct ethnic or religious group, you have adversaries, opponents, and even enemies. That's as much part of the American story as the Statue of Liberty, the melting pot, and checks and balances. America, we should recall, is different from almost every other country in the world, apart from the Native Americans, who make up a very small part of our population. Everyone in our country comes from someplace else. We're all immigrants, just that some of us came more recently than others. What binds us together as Americans, therefore, is not religion or ethnicity or national origin. It is an idea, the idea of opportunity, of personal liberty, of growing communities, of creating, as our founding document says, a more perfect union, something for which we continually strive but never quite achieve. It's a powerful idea, attractive to many, threatening to some. If you look at our history, we have fought wars against foreign foes to defend this idea, from the Revolutionary War to World War II to the war to liberate Kuwait. But if you look closely, you will see enemies of this idea inside our country too. Take a look at the terrorists. Yes, we can use that term. The terrorists who have killed our presidents over the years. Since the founding of the Republic, 4 have been assassinated: Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John Kennedy. Who killed them? All Americans, not a foreigner among them. Lincoln was killed by a man who hated the idea of the Union, that individual states were subject to the will of the federal government, that America would rise or fall on commitment to this idea. Garfield was killed by a religious zealot who thought he was ordained by God to assassinate the president and ascend himself to high position. McKinley was killed by an anarchist, someone who believed in no government at all, but in the beauty of chaos. And Kennedy was killed by a former Marine who was infatuated with Marxism and the communist experiment. 4 very different men with one common thread. They hated the American idea. All men created equal, equal justice under law, one man, one vote, slow, incremental, but persistent change. Are there others out there who hate the American idea? Absolutely. They live on the margins of both the hard right and the hard left. They live on the margins of great religions. The key phrase is, they live on the margins. But as we have seen with terrible consequences in recent years, whether it's in a church in Charleston, a synagogue in Pittsburgh, a concert venue in Las Vegas, or an elementary school in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, their actions can be devastating. So as we rightly enhance our security to stop terrorists from abroad, let's not lower our guard to the terrorists within. For more than 150 years, they have tried in vain to kill the American idea. Their failure doesn't mean they won't try again. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول خطر الإرهاب المحلي، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.